I'm Barbara from Santa Barbara. They named the whole city after me. I want to tell you a little bit about myself before I start with the near-death experience information, because I think giving you a bigger picture of my life kind of is going to tie into some of the near-death experience information you're going to hear in a little bit. So I was born and raised in Salem, Oregon, and as a young person, I was the fourth out of 5 children. And my father worked for the state of Oregon. My mom ended up being a police officer with the Marion County Deputy Sheriffs, and she outshot all the men on the police force. She was a pretty powerful and brave woman. When I moved to Santa Barbara, I was about mid-20s, and I married someone who lived down in Santa Barbara, and we relocated there to where his home was. And many years passed. I had a little son that was, by the time I had my near-death experience, I had my little son who was 8 years old. And in 1987, I had a brand new daughter that was 5 months old when I had my near-death experience. And what happened was that I injured my back lifting something too heavy. And the first doctor that I saw said, I was 31 years old, and he said, I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do to fix this, and you're not going to walk again. I'd lost the left leg, and the power of the left leg was diminished by 70%, so I only had 30% capacity in my left leg. So I couldn't walk, and that was a terrible blow at 31 years old with 2 kids. I didn't want to hear that. So I went to the people that I knew, especially the people that I knew at my church. I was going to a Lutheran church at the time. And they suggested that I go to a particular neurosurgeon in Santa Barbara. He was really well known, and I got in to see him with all of my MRIs and my x-rays and my CAT scans that had been done. And he rather cockily held up my x-rays and looked at my MRIs and said, oh, I can fix this. I wanted to believe him. Really badly did I want to believe him. So we scheduled surgery. It was 1 month when my daughter was born in July. It was only a month later when I injured my back, and it was the early part of December when we finally got the surgery scheduled to fix it. But the neurosurgeon brought on his team an orthopedic surgeon because both of them were going to need to work on the area. It was a blown disc at my L5, S1 area, which is your very lower back. The day before the actual surgery was going to happen, they asked me to check into the hospital early, and they said they needed to do another test before they did the surgery the next day, and this was a test that was going to determine if my spinal cord had been damaged when the disc blew out. They were concerned that maybe I'd had one of the fragments of the disc chip the spinal cord. So they were doing a myelogram where they inject iodine dye into the back of your neck. And they told me I needed to lay really still because one of the after effects of this particular test is terrible headaches for weeks on end if you move. So I was going to be a good girl, and they had me laying on an x-ray table. And I was face up after they'd injected the dye. They had me turn back over so I was face up. And then they had a button on the x-ray table, and the x-ray tech was going to push that button and raise my head and lower my feet so that the dye with gravity would go down my spine. And the other x-ray tech over to the left of the table had a big monitor, and he was going to watch on the monitor, and when the dye got to the place where my spine had the damage down in the L5, then that was going to be where he was going to take the pictures at. But both the neurosurgeon and the orthopedic surgeon were in the room because it was about 5:00 p.m. before they were doing a 7 a.m. surgery the next day, and I think that they felt it would be better to see the pictures live when it was occurring rather than have something printed out and have to deal with that in the evening or the next morning before the surgery. So both of them, luckily, were in the room, and that's what saved my life. There was also a nurse in the room. Everything was going fine, and they started moving the x-ray table, and it had this slow whirring sound like rrrr. And I'm laying on the table, and I'm not scared, I'm not upset, I'm not worried, I'm just having a test done. I'm really looking forward to tomorrow's surgery because I'm hoping they're going to fix me. Pretty quickly, after the table started moving, I started feeling kind of funny, and I thought, am I supposed to feel this way? I kind of feel disoriented, like I'm kind of losing my ability to think clearly. But the guy pushing the button on the x-ray machine was talking to the guy who was in front of the monitor about their upcoming weekend plans, and I didn't want to interrupt them. I was being really polite. The doctors were behind them over in the back part of the room, and the nurse was over at a desk kind of table type of thing. And so nobody really noticed that the table was being pushed, the wrong button was being pushed, and the head was being lowered, and the feet were being raised. So the dye that they just injected into the base of my neck right there, right, base of my skull, was going into my brain. So that's why I felt kind of funny, and that's why I was losing my ability to think, because the dye was invading my brain. So as things progressed, it was very quickly, and I couldn't remain conscious any longer. I knew that I was going to faint. I thought I was going to faint. I did not know I was going to die. I wasn't scared, but I was concerned, and my eyes started rolling to the back of my head, and I couldn't stay present and stay focused any longer. And then the last thing that happened was that I started hyperventilating. That hyperventilating was what triggered the guy with his finger on the button to hear that I was breathing weird, and he stopped talking to the other guy, and he leaned over the table and looked into my eyes. At that point, my eyes, I couldn't stay focused on him. They were rolling backwards, and I had lost any ability to reach out and touch him. I had thought, like partway through this process, I should let him know because this is really scary. But by the time I thought that, I couldn't even touch him. I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand to touch him or to say anything. I couldn't figure out how to actually form a word or make a noise or anything. Nothing was connecting between my brain and what was my body. So he saw my eyes rolling back, and he stood up and he leaned back and he looked where his thumb was on the machine. And right when he did that, the look of, oh my God, came over his face. And that was the last thing I saw. My eyes shut in my body, and in the next second, I was up above my body on the ceiling, and it literally felt as though the ceiling was against the back of my head. If you place your hand against the back of your head and apply a little bit of pressure, that's all that I felt up there. I don't think I actually had a body or anything, but it was weird. I felt like I'd hit a perimeter that I couldn't go beyond. And a lot of MDEers report that same thing, whether it be a wall or a ceiling or in the corner of the room, just feeling like they can't exit the room. That's a very common thing with NDEers. They feel that they hit a barrier. So up on the ceiling in that second, I looked down and saw my body, and I felt not really connected to it at all. It felt like I was looking at a wetsuit. I was just looking down at it, and very calmly, the first thing I said was, in my head, of course, if he's calling code blue and I'm up here and my body's down there, then I think I just died. There was no alarm, no upset, no worry, no freaking out. In that very moment that I said that, there was an amazing presence next to me that immediately I felt was right here to my left-hand side. And the presence didn't have any physical, I felt so strongly that I knew who that was, that I'd been connected to them for so long, that I didn't even feel that I needed to look over to see who they were. I knew who they were so strongly. And the presence felt like God to me. It felt like I was connected to the presence from this point all the way back to eternity that way, and from this point all the way to eternity in the future. I literally felt this amazing, beautiful love, acceptance. The first thing I said to him was, I don't want to leave this life. I want to go back. If I leave my children, then they'll turn out to be very different than if I'm in their life to contribute to them. And so I don't want to leave. And there wasn't any communication really coming from him until one point. And the next thing that I said, now all this is unfolding down below me, I'm watching the resuscitation effort. So the, code blue triggered the whole room to go into a pretty wild, and it seemed very loud and obnoxious resuscitation effort below. So as I'm up on the ceiling, I'm talking to him in this calm way, but I'm watching all of this craziness down below. And the second thing that I said to him was, I know that I have not completed my purpose that I came here to do. I knew exactly what I had planned to do in this life. Up there on the ceiling, I knew exactly what it was. And I said, I haven't even completed that yet, and I need to go back to do that work. Down below, the doctors are reacting. They're nurses on the phone calling for a defib unit. They bring in an oxygen cart and they put it next to the x-ray table and they put an oxygen mask on my face. I'm watching. Then this man comes in. I'm talking to God over here. And this older man comes in, probably in his 60s, and he brings in a box that he sets on a shelf right next to the x-ray table. And he starts to put these round circles that are on my chest. And as I'm talking to God, I'm looking at that guy. Now, I understood the oxygen cart. That one I understood. But when that man put the box on the shelf and started putting those little things on, I didn't know what he was doing. And I hadn't had any medical background, and I don't watch TV, so I didn't know what that was. And I said, in my conversation over here, I said, well, what is that he's doing? Just, like you're watching something, and what's that he's doing? Right then, I was moved from up on the ceiling to right in front of the box. So I didn't want to move. I think I was moved by God. I think he showed me this. I was right in front of the box. It hadn't been turned on yet. And when the man flicked a little toggle switch on the side, the screen lit up, and I was like right in front of the screen like this. My consciousness was right in front of it. And a little green light lit up, and it was making this monotone sound, kind of like beep, like that. And when it traveled across the screen, and I watched it, and then it went back, and it started again, and it traveled across the screen, and I watched it, and I wasn't getting what it was. And the third time it started to travel across the screen, all of a sudden I went, oh, I think that's a heart monitor. It's supposed to be going like this. So I actually saw my flat line. So once I said, oh, I think that's supposed to be going like this, that's a heart monitor, then all of a sudden I was back up on the ceiling again. So I had been shown what it was I asked for. Gee, I wish I would have asked to go to Hawaii or maybe over to Paris, or I just got to see the flat line. But up on the ceiling, I continued talking with God, and they continued the resuscitation effort. They weren't getting the defib unit in. It was 1987. It was a Catholic hospital in Santa Barbara called St. Francis Hospital. I'm not sure how many defib units they had. I didn't have any. After the NDE, I didn't have any follow-up with the hospital because they did not want to talk to me or tell me anything about my near-death experience because of the liability issues that they faced, because it was an error. And interestingly, I knew it was an error. I never sued them. I did want to find out what it was, but I never got my records. They destroyed them. And I never got anything. What ended up happening was I'm up on the ceiling. I'm talking and I'm saying, I want to go back to my children. I want to raise my children. I want to go back into this life. I want to do my purpose. I want to be here. And the other thing that I got asked by God was very interesting, because my beautiful husband I'm remarried, and the person I was married to at the time was an engineer. And I'd been married to him about 8 years, and I'd had a lot of problems with his behaviors. I could say controlling, I could say manipulative, I could say physically abusive, I could say emotionally abusive. And I was trying really hard to help change who he was. And I was trying to use who I was to help him become a better person. And I wasn't giving up on him. So up on the ceiling, when I said, I wanted to stay and then I wanted to complete my purpose, my question that I got asked was, well, if you go back, what about the situation that you're in that situation with your marriage? I felt I was also in a kind of a dangerous situation. There were times when I worried that he might kill me because I was very highly insured. And so up there facing God, I said, if you let me go back, then I promise that I'll do my best to get away. I will. I promise I'll leave him. So that was a promise that I had to hold to. It took me 3 years to leave him. I was afraid of, if I left him, what the physical would happen, because I was afraid of him and his behaviors, that I might actually be killed when I left him. So there was a lot of scaredness in me, and I had really not a support system to turn to. So I struggled through those 3 years, but what I did was I did what I could to find a date that I could look forward to that would be a date where he would be gone on a business trip for a week. And that week was going to be my escape week. And I planned it for a really long time before he went on the business trip. I ended up escaping. I had to file a restraining order to keep him from coming over and not that would keep him from doing anything, but somehow I escaped any further harm. Went through a really traumatic divorce. Terrible times. But when I was up on that ceiling again, as I was looking down and talking to God, and I made that decision that I would, leave him, and I'd kind of, reiterated over and again that I wanted to go back. What was happening down below was that the 2 doctors, they were doing CPR around the table, and so the nurse and the x-ray tech and another man were dealing with my body, and the 2 doctors were actually standing behind them, allowing them to do that work. And they had a conversation, and they said, too much time is passing. She's going to have brain damage. I think about 8 to 10 minutes had passed. They still didn't have the defib unit in there yet. So the 2 doctors decided that they would do a last-ditch effort that they're only allowed to do if they witness someone going into cardiac arrest. That's why it was really lucky for me that the doctors were present when this happened, because I wouldn't be here if they hadn't been in the room. What they did was called a precordial thump. And the orthopedic surgeon said, stand clear, and the people around the table stepped backwards, and he stepped 2 steps forwards, and he just took his fist like this, and he just went wham, and smacked me right in the chest. It didn't hurt. I was up on the ceiling. I wasn't in the wetsuit. So I watched that, but it was very traumatic looking to see that kind of a blow on your body down below. And the second time that he wound up and he struck me the second time, right as his fist connected with my chest, my eyes shut up there, and the next second I blinked my eyes open, and I was looking right into his face from my body. And I knew that I had just traveled back down into my body. So it was literally up, full consciousness while I was up there on the ceiling, watching everything, talking to God or whatever, whoever that was, my guardian angel, whoever that might have been. And then back down again. The minute that I got into my body, I had the oxygen mask on my face, and I started talking into the oxygen mask. 31 years old, I'm just like, what was that? What just happened? This woman, who was one of the nurses, leaned over me and said, don't talk. We need to stabilize you. Don't talk. So I'm like wanting so badly to blurt out and ask questions about what just happened to me. When they finally took the oxygen mask off 20 minutes later, everybody was waiting to see what I was going to say. And I immediately said, I can't believe what just happened. I went out of my body and I was up on the ceiling during the whole resuscitation. What just happened? What just happened? And I was just completely wanting them to tell me. And of course, they all looked at each other, and the neurosurgeon said, oh, brother. And that made me continue to say, what just happened? No, really, I could see you, and and look, she's the person who brought in the oxygen cart, and she put the mask on my face, and then that man over there came in with the heart monitor, and I saw him connected up, and I saw it flatlining. And then you said this to him, and he said that to you, and I recounted their conversation. Well, that's when the neurosurgeon turned completely white, and he stuttered, I'm not going to stand here and listen to this. And he stormed out of the room. The orthopedic surgeon held my hand, talked to me. Everybody in the room stayed there. I noticed nobody left. They wanted to hear what I was going to say. And he comforted me, but then they put me on a gurney and they sent me up to my room, and no one else in the 4 days that I was there. The surgery was done the next morning, on track. Stayed 3 days later, no one would talk to me. Every time someone came in my room, I'd say, could you please tell me what happened on, the night that I had my test done? And they said, test? I don't know what you're talking about. Completely. And I was just getting so frustrated. So of course I asked the doctors, and they said, I don't want to talk about it. And so I got nothing out of anyone. And I left the hospital, but before I did, my husband came to visit me the day of the surgery, and with my little daughter and my son, and I told him what happened during the myelogram. And he said, oh, well, that doesn't sound real. You probably hallucinated it. Well, that closed me down completely, because did I want to have a reputation of hallucinating? No, I didn't. I've never had any kind of mental issues, and I didn't want anyone to think I did. So I just put that in a box inside me, and that story and that reality of that happening to me stayed locked up for 20 years. I didn't tell anybody. So what ended up causing it to come out led to a lot of amazing discoveries for me. So I feel sad that I had those 20 years lost, because if they would have just been honest with me at the time, and if there had been information that I could have accessed, like brochures from IANS, or back then there wasn't a website, but now there's an amazing website. There are other websites like the NDERF Foundation, which is Near-Death Experience Research Foundation. They have thousands of near-death experiences on their website that you can actually read everybody's descriptions of their near-death experiences for days and days on end. But it didn't exist back then. So it was very difficult for me to have that locked up for 20 years. Of course, I was raising my children. 3 years later, I left my husband. I was a single mom for 2 years before my son, who was in junior high school, met my new husband's daughter, and they became friends, and we lived only half a block away from each other and didn't know the other person existed. And we ended up getting married, and we've been married 23 years, and our kids are all mixed and happy with brothers and sisters, and we have 5 altogether. But it turned out great in my personal life, but that time taught me a lot from that previous experience with that previous husband. It taught me a lot. And what ended up happening was I was sitting in a gymnastics practice at UCSB for my little daughter, and she was probably maybe 13 years old or something. And what ended up happening was a woman that was talking to me said her mom was dying, and she was a nurse at Cottage Hospital. So I somehow felt that I needed to tell her about my near-death experience. I thought it would help her to know what it felt like when you were dead. I thought that would be beneficial to her. I didn't know that there were other people talking about their NDEs out there in the world, or that there was organizations or anything. And it ended up that she validated my near-death experience for me. She said, after I told her what had happened, she said, you know, everything that you've said lines up, and I believe exactly what you're saying, because she's the person who told me that it's called a precordial thump, and she's the person who told me that the doctor's not allowed to do that striking motion unless he's in the room and sees me go into cardiac arrest. So she helped me to kind of validate my near-death experience, because all those years I had it in the box. I thought, you know, did it really happen? Am I remembering it right? Is it real? You know, if you don't talk about something for a really long time, all of a sudden you start, you know, am I remembering it right? It is the clearest thing, the clearest memory that I have. And so for me, I needed somebody to validate it, and she served that purpose beautifully. So I ended up going online, finding the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, and over a 3-day period, I wrote up my near-death experience to submit it to that website, not knowing what that would bring. About 2 years later, the person who runs that website is a radiation oncologist named Dr. Jeffrey Long, and very big in the near-death experience world. And he called me and he said, introduced himself and said the Discovery Channel was looking to do a 2-hour special on NDEs. And they had culled out of his 5,000 NDEs 20 that they were interested in, and mine was one of them. Because I had validated with the doctors what they had said and done after I came down off the ceiling, they felt that that was very important, because most NDEers don't say anything after it happens, but I instead recounted the resuscitation efforts. So I ended up talking to the Discovery Channel producer out of Silver Springs, Maryland, for something like 4 hours. And then he said, well, I need to have the physician's telephone number and name so that I can contact him. And I thought, oh God. I had tried to talk to that orthopedic surgeon a couple times when I had gone back for orthopedic issues over my back, and he had changed the subject immediately. Never would actually talk to me about it. I knew the neurosurgeon would never talk to me, because when I went back after the surgery, I was required to go 2 weeks later to visit him, and I was sitting in his examining room waiting for him to come in, and this is what he did. Walked up to me sitting at the chair, put his hand in my face about 2 inches away from my face and said, look, if you want to talk at all about what happened to you during your myelogram, then you can get out of my office right now and find yourself another neurosurgeon. So I knew he was a flatline, no way, but I gave the orthopedic surgeon's name, and he ended up talking to the Discovery Channel and director, and he said, look, I'll admit she had a near-death experience on TV. I will admit that, because that is the truth. But I can't talk about the specifics, because my colleagues and my patients, I'll be out in the cold at that point if I come forward and actually tell the truth about what happened. Another thing that happened that he validated my NDE was that his right-hand assistant came into a store that I owned in Santa Barbara when I was named Businesswoman of the Year. I had a business in Santa Barbara, and I didn't know her, and she ended up talking to me and becoming friendly with me. And when I found out where she worked, I said, you work for him? Well, he saved my life in 1987. If I told you the story, do you think you could ask him if he remembers it? And would you see what he says about it? She said, well, sure. She called me and she said, he says that he not only remembers, this is the first incident where I talked to him about it, then I ended up going back to him and actually trying to get him to talk about it directly to me, and he wouldn't. But the first opening was her talking to him about it, and he told her he not only remembered the incident, but that it changed his medical protocol, because if I could come down off the ceiling and tell them accurately what they said and did while I was flatlining, then so could anybody else. And he'd better make sure that he does absolutely everything by the book and doesn't say or do anything that could be reported afterwards. So time passed, and Dr. Jeffrey Long called me again, and it was 2009 by this time. And he said, Barbara, the IANS organization is going to have their conference in San Diego this year. And I think that Jody and I, his wife and he, would like to invite you as our guest to attend the conference, because you'll be able to meet other near-death experiencers. I was so excited to find anybody else that this had happened to. That's like finding family. So we made arrangements, and I went down to the conference. It was a 3-day conference. The very first night, I'm looking around. I don't know what Jeff Long looks like, so I'm asking the people that are working behind the desk, could you show me who Jeff Long is? And finally someone pointed him out, so I went over and introduced myself. Oh, nice to meet you. Yeah. But he had a number of people that had gathered around him that were pretty high-level IANS and NDE researchers. So I didn't know anybody else there, and I felt a little bit uncomfortable, so I thought, well, I'll just, stand here and listen to their conversation, even though I'm a newbie and I don't understand half of it. I'll just stand here and, act like I'm knowledgeable, even though I'm not. So I'm standing there, and they're talking on these. The subject of the conference was after effects of near-death experiencers. So they had come through research, had developed what they thought were a list of what the experiencers worldwide have after they've experienced an NDE. One of them is a lack of fear of death. We literally lose any fear of death because we realize that it doesn't hurt to die, that we just shed the skin. We're still us up on the ceiling. And it totally takes away any fear of death. It doesn't mean you want to hasten your death, but it means that you don't have any fear of it anymore. It's like you're going to the toy store. You get to go home again. So another one is they've decided that NDEers have a strong dislike of loud noises. They are very sensitive to bright light. They have amazing intuition, and it shows pretty strongly, and it comes out in them very strongly, and they're able to predict, or they're able to know something's going to be happening, that they're able to kind of alter what happens. Well, as they were saying these things, I was standing there going, wait a minute. Why are they saying those are after effects to a near-death experience? I've had those ever since I was young. I've never had a fear of death. I've flown airplanes. I have raced sports cars. I have jumped off bridges that were 60 feet high and into water. I was the wild little redhead as I was growing up, and I had no fear of death. And I had amazing intuition stuff that occurred in my early years that my mom used to say, don't tell anybody that you can do that. I literally one time at 7 years old was standing on a street corner, and all of a sudden, holding my mom's hand, and all of a sudden I went, and my mom goes, what are you doing? And I said, there's going to be 2 cars that are going to crash. And I'm going like this, and all of a sudden these 2 cars in the intersection run into each other. And my mom's looking down at me going, don't tell anybody that you can do that. I heard that a lot of times. So I'm standing there listening to these guys saying intuition and all this stuff, and I'm going, yeah, I never liked rock concerts. What teenager doesn't want to go to a rock concert? Who didn't play music loud? Who doesn't like people who are talking loud? Who doesn't like bright lights? So I went, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. Why do I have all the after effects before I had the near-death experience? It doesn't make any sense. So after they stopped talking in a kind of a large group, I turned to the lady next to me. I didn't know who she was. Jeff was talking with Jody to someone on their side over there. So I said, I'm sorry, I don't understand. Why would I have the after effects all the way back to my earliest childhood memories? That doesn't make any sense. It turned out to be PMH Atwater, who's written about 17 books on near-death experiences, a researcher. She's written the big book of near-death experiences. She's written The Idiot's Guide to Near-Death Experiences. I mean, literally, this woman, oh my gosh, she has an amazing career studying near-death experiences. I didn't know who she was. And she takes my hands and she says, my dear, I think that you ought to investigate with your family if you had a near-death experience when you were young. Well, I'm sure I kept my face normal, but I thought in my head, okay, wouldn't I know if I had a near-death experience when I was young? Come on. Are these people thinking that we have more than one near-death experience in our life? That can't be true. But the thought, as I went through the 3-day conference, kept circulating around, and I tried to think of anything that I might remember that would indicate that I'd had any kind of experience when I was young. So as I was thinking, I thought, well, there were those 3 times when I was young, all the way, I think the last time my mom said it was when I was 16, and I don't remember what brought it up, but she said, you really scared us when you were young. There was a really big time when we were really scared for you, and I'm really happy and glad you're here. And at the time when I was young, I didn't think anything of it. It was like, well, okay, I'm happy I'm here too, Mom. And it didn't make any sense to me because I didn't know the incident. So I didn't know what she was referring to. So after the conference, I decided, since we were going up to Oregon, we were going to see my older brother, and he's 10 years older than me. I needed to figure out a way to ask him if I'd had any kind of a physical experience when I was young that would have led to an NDE. But he didn't know about my near-death experience. I hadn't spoken to it with my family, hadn't talked about it. Victor was the only one that knew about it other than my ex-husband. So I said to my brother when we saw him, hey, I'm doing a medical history on myself all the way back to birth, and I'm documenting everything so that in case, things happen in the future, that I can just have a written document of all this information. I remember when I fell and put my thumb all the way back to my wrist, and I remember when I fell off the jungle gym and hurt my arm, and I remember when I did something with my foot and I had a cast. But I said, is there anything else that I don't know about that you need to tell me? He said, well, let me think about that, and not that I can think of, but let me just think about that for a while. At the end of the dinner, we were having dinner with him. He came up to me just as we were leaving the restaurant, and Victor was standing next to me. He said, hey, Barbie, there's something that I should have told you about a long time ago, but I really, truly forgot about it. Because when it happened, Mom and Dad said that we weren't supposed to talk about it ever again. And I was 12. He was 12. He was saying this to me. He said, I was 12. And he said, you were 18 months old. And you had some sort of a childhood disease. He said, I don't know what you were sick with, but you had a really high fever. And he said, you went into convulsions and you stopped breathing. So Dad ran in and used the phone and called the fire department. It was 1958. And the fire department told my dad to tell my mom to put me into tepid bath water and then slowly add ice cubes. They were sending the ambulance over, but before the ambulance got there, they were going to try to lower my body temperature. But if you put a child that's got a high fever into very cold water, it'll cause them to go into shock. And so they wanted them to add the ice cubes slowly. So my mom was pregnant with my little sister. She's 20 months younger than me. And she was putting me in the water, but we only had one tray of ice cubes. So my brother said that he and my other brother, who was 10 years old at the time, so oldest was 12, second was 10, they were sent off to the neighbors' houses to get the ice cubes. When my brother came back, he said he doesn't know how much time passed, but when he came around the corner into the bathroom, I was purple. So he said that he knew Mom was sobbing over my body, and I was purple and I was lifeless, and he knew it was a big problem. Right as my other brother arrived with ice cubes from the other houses that he'd gone to, they heard the ambulance pull up in front of the house. And as the siren was winding down, so the ambulance techs were probably getting their equipment or whatever, I spontaneously took a breath, and my brother saw me do it, and he said, you just were completely lifeless, and you were, like this, and then all of a sudden you went, like that. And he said, you came back to life. You went from purple to bright red, and you started crying, and right as the ambulance techs came in the house, you were crying, and you were breathing again, and Mom was crying, and everything was in chaos. They were pushed aside, and the ambulance techs took me off to the hospital. And my older sister was downstairs at the time with our nanny, and she remembers the incident because the nanny told her she couldn't come upstairs because I was having a temper tantrum. So when she came upstairs, just as my mom was running out the front door with her purse to follow the ambulance to the hospital, my sister blurted out, how come Barbie was having a temper tantrum? And my mom said, oh my God, why would you say that? And she said, well, that's what the nanny said. And my mom looked at the nanny and said, I'll talk to you when I get home. And the nanny was fired when she got home from the hospital. So my sister remembers the incident because of her impact of losing the nanny, who she liked a lot. But the nanny, I guess my mom felt that she wasn't sensitive to the fact that I had been dead upstairs, and she was telling my sister that I was temper tantruming. So I have that really strong feeling since I have the after effects, and I had, both siblings confirm to me that that incident occurred, that I had a near-death experience when I was young. Finding that out really changed my life much more than the second NDE, because all of the things that didn't make sense to me in my childhood all of a sudden made sense. I was a very empathetic child as I was young, and I was very lively, but I would actually go over to the elderly neighbors' houses, and I would take them flowers, or I would sit and talk with them, or I would just go to visit. And on Mother's Day or May Day, I would celebrate all the elderly people in our neighborhood. By the time I was 14, I was volunteering. By the time I was 16, I was the Easter Bunny for a big Easter Bunny event. I really cared about people, and I was much different than my family. And I used to lay in bed at night and I would talk to God at 5 years old. And my mom would look at me. They didn't go to church or anything. They baptized us and then never took us to church. And she'd go, where did you come from? It all made sense to me once I figured out that I had actually, at 18 months, gone back and visited home. Then, when I was 31, I got to go back. And what I feel like God came to me that time, and he told me his presence was there. So, for me, that gave me a ton of connection to feeling that there is an existence past death. It is a beautiful existence that we can look forward to. Nothing to fear whatsoever about getting there. Of course, I don't want to die in a car accident or something terrible, but whatever it is, we planned it. There are so many people that are near-death experiencers that talk about their plans that they had for their life, and they end up connecting with that through their near-death experience. They find that they discover what their plan was for their life when they have their near-death experience. So for me, it was an amazing, wonderful journey, and I wouldn't bypass it for anything. I realized that my purpose is to come and talk to groups like you, to give any individual who listen the chance to know that death is not scary. It is really beautiful, and it's really about going home. I kind of feel like this is our educational period when we're here on the earth and we're getting challenged and we're having issues and problems and we're seeing how we handle them. But then we get to go home, and home is the beautiful, really amazing place that we look forward to returning to. So I hope that my story has helped you in some way, and I hope you'll pass it on freely. There are a lot of people who've written books about near-death experiences, and you can get those books and read them, or you can read and see a lot of stuff online on YouTube. If you just put in near-death experience on YouTube, you'll get my video of me talking. You'll get 100 videos, 1,000 videos of people talking about their near-death experiences, because they happen to children all the way up through elderly people, as well as across the entire world and all religions. So it's a very amazing experience that hasn't just been happening since we have been, in the last 100 years. We're talking about the first known near-death experience was logged clear back in Plato's time. So this is not something new. It's just something that I think was hidden from us. And I think that it's coming out more and more as people are brave enough to stand up and talk about it. There's going to be an amazing movie that's coming out in a year and a half. Anita Morjani, who was in stage 4B of lymphoma, had a near-death experience, and she wrote a book afterwards, after she came out of a coma, where she definitely wasn't expected to live more than another 48 hours. She came out of her coma and she wrote a book called Dying to Be Me. Her book is going to be made into a movie. They're working on it right now. And the producer and director is Ridley Scott, a very famous man who just put out The Martian, the movie that's about the man who was stranded on Mars. And it's an amazing movie if you want to go see it. It's very cool. But it'll be out in a year and a half. And with each of these people who have these books that they've written or the talks that they give, then as the world starts understanding this, then I think we're coming out of our death is scary shell, and we're going to be able to live our lives in a much bigger, beautiful, and more connected way with everybody. So thank you very much for letting me talk today. Thank you.